Born in 354 AD in Thagaste, a small city in Roman Africa in present-day Algeria, Augustine grew up in a family divided between two worlds. His mother, Monica, was a fervent Christian, devout to the point of obsession, convinced with absolute certainty that her son was destined for sainthood. His father, Patricius, was an indifferent pagan, more interested in social ambition than spiritual matters. Augustine inherited from both, his mother's spiritual intensity, his father's worldly ambition, and he spent the first 30 years of his life trying to reconcile them, without success. He was extraordinarily brilliant. He knew it. He studied rhetoric in Carthage, the metropolis of Roman North Africa, and quickly became one of the most gifted orators of his generation. Words came to him easily, persuasively, elegantly. Success seemed within reach. But there was a problem, or rather, there were many problems, and Augustine saw them all with an almost cruel clarity. He was sexually insatiable. He took a concubine at 16, a woman whose name has not been passed down to us, who remained with him for almost 15 years and gave him a son, Adeodatus, the gift of God. He loved her in his way, but he did not respect her enough to marry her. He was intellectually restless. He embraced Manichaeism, a dualist religion that explained the evil of the world as an independent cosmic force, which had the practical advantage of relieving the individual of responsibility for their own actions. If evil is an external force, I am not the problem. It is convenient, Manichaeism. Augustine understood this after 9 years and abandoned it. He was ambitious in the wrong way, seeking success to fill a void that success could not fill. And he knew all of this. He saw himself with a lucidity that was almost frightening. He understood exactly what he was doing, exactly why it was wrong, exactly the price he was paying. And he continued anyway. He wrote a sentence that neuropsychologists still cite today in their research on motivational conflict. Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. 7 words. Perhaps the most honest that a human being has ever written about themselves. It was not hypocrisy. It was something far more subtle and far more human. The condition of one who sees the right path clearly and deliberately takes the wrong one. Modern psychologists call it akrasia. Augustine described it from the inside, with an anatomical precision that Freud would only reach 16 centuries later. My will was divided against itself, he wrote in the Confessions. Part of me wanted to rise, the other wanted to stay on the ground, and the struggle was within me, against me. At 32, Augustine left Africa for Rome, then Milan, then the capital of the Western Roman Empire, the center of power and culture. He obtained an imperial chair of rhetoric, the most prestigious position an intellectual of the era could aspire to. He had everything he had sought, the career, the recognition, the power, and he was not happy. On the contrary, he was more restless than before. In Milan, he encountered Bishop Ambrose, one of the most intelligent and charismatic men of his time. He listened to him preach, initially for purely aesthetic reasons. Ambrose was an extraordinary orator, and Augustine was a rhetoric professional who appreciated technique. But the ideas Ambrose expressed began to enter him in ways he had not anticipated. At the same time, he discovered Neoplatonic philosophy, Plotinus, Porphyry, which gave him the intellectual tools to conceive of God not as a corporeal being, but as pure spiritual reality. His intellectual obstacle to Christianity began to crumble. The moral obstacle remained. The flesh remained. The inner war remained. Summer of 386. A garden in Milan. Augustine is 32 years old. He is weeping, not from sadness, from exasperation, from exhaustion with himself. Years of inner struggle, years of knowing and not doing, years of wanting to change and not changing have worn him to the bone. Then he hears a voice. A child's voice, from the other side of the garden wall, singing a chant, Tolle, lege, tolle, lege. Take up and read, take up and read. Augustine takes the text of Paul he had with him and opens it at random. His eyes fall on a passage from the letter to the Romans. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. And in that moment, he himself recounts, something breaks, not the resistance, the tension, like a string that had been stretched for too long and that finally, instead of snapping, goes slack. His conversion was not a victory of the will. It was a surrender, the moment when he stopped fighting himself and accepted that he did not have total control. Modern therapists call this moment a therapeutic collapse of the ego. Addiction programs call it surrendering to a higher power. Augustine lived it beneath a fig tree on a summer afternoon in Milan, with tears on his face. Augustine returned to Africa. He was baptized. He sold his possessions and founded a small monastic community in Thagaste, his hometown. He wanted a quiet life of prayer and study. He was not granted it. In 391 he found himself in Hippo, a port city in North Africa, when the local bishop spotted him in the crowd during a sermon and pointed him out before the congregation. That man must become a priest. The crowd carried him almost bodily before the bishop. Augustine wept, not from joy, but from fear. He did not feel worthy. He did not feel ready. 4 years later he was bishop of Hippo, a role he would hold for 34 years, until his death. As bishop, Augustine was tireless. He preached almost every day. He wrote with a productivity that left his contemporaries speechless. His complete works occupy almost 100,000 pages. He governed the diocese, resolved legal disputes, managed the distribution of food to the poor, combated the heresies of his time with theological treatises of extraordinary complexity. His principal works, the Confessions, the City of God, the De Trinitate, redefined Christian theology so profoundly that still today, 16 centuries later, they are compulsory texts in Catholic seminaries throughout the world. Augustine died on 28 August 430, at 76 years of age. Hippo was under siege by the Vandals, the barbarians who were dismantling the Western Roman Empire piece by piece. He died during the siege while the city burned around him. In his final days, he had asked that the penitential Psalms of David be written on the walls of his room. He read them continuously, weeping. Not the venerated bishop, not the doctor of the church, not the illustrious philosopher. Simply an old man looking inside himself one last time with the same ruthless honesty with which he had always done so. His legacy is incalculable. He shaped Catholic and Protestant theology alike. Luther and Calvin considered him their principal patristic reference. He introduced into Western literature the concept of psychological autobiography. He was the first to formulate the idea that time is an interior experience, not an external reality. He described the conflict of the will with a precision that modern psychology has simply translated into scientific language. "Our heart is restless," he wrote at the opening of the Confessions, "until it rests in thee." But that restlessness, that inner war he could not win, that ruthless lucidity with which he looked at himself in the darkness of his own mind, was not only his torment, it was his gift to the world. Without it, he would never have written the words that 2,000 years later still help us understand what it means to be human.